I want to tell you about a phrase my son said to me, sitting in my own kitchen, that I have never fully forgiven him for, even though I understand, now, that he meant it kindly. He said, "Mom, at some point, you have to accept that this is just what the last chapter looks like." He was talking about being alone. He was talking about it the way you'd talk about a change in the weather, not a tragedy, just a fact of the season. Something you dress for rather than something you fight. I was 81 years old when he said that to me, sitting at the same kitchen table where I'd fed him breakfast for 18 years of his childhood, and I remember looking at him and thinking, I am not dressing for this weather. I am moving to a different climate entirely. My name is Vivian Ashworth. I'm 82 years old. And exactly 1 year ago, I refused to accept that my final years were supposed to be quiet, small, and solitary. So I sold nearly everything I owned, and I moved to a small island in the central Philippines called Bohol, where I have spent the last 12 months building the most connected, most surprising, most alive year of my entire life. I want to tell you how a woman my age does something like this. I want to be honest about the 3 weeks in the middle of it when my heart, quite literally, my actual heart, nearly ended the whole story. And I want to tell you what I understand now about the difference between accepting your circumstances and accepting someone else's diagnosis of your circumstances. I grew up outside Richmond, Virginia, and I spent most of my adult life as a hospital administrator, 36 years at the same regional medical center, working my way from a records clerk to running an entire department. I understood systems. I understood how to read a situation and make a plan. That matters for what comes later in this story, so I want you to hold on to it. I married Walter Ashworth when I was 24. He was a pharmacist, quiet and steady, in a way that balanced out my tendency to run every room I was in. We had 2 children, my son Bradley and my daughter Susan, and we built a life in a colonial-style house in a good school district, the kind of life that looks, from the outside, exactly like the American dream is supposed to look. Walter died 6 years ago. Complications from diabetes, a slow decline over nearly 3 years that I nursed him through, and I want to say plainly that watching someone you've loved for 52 years diminish slowly, in pieces, teaches you things about grief that a sudden loss doesn't. You grieve the whole time it's happening, and then you grieve again once it's over, and somehow both griefs are entirely real and entirely separate. After Walter passed, I was 76 years old. Bradley lived in Charlotte, 45 minutes away, close enough that distance was never really the excuse. Susan lived further, out in Denver, and called weekly, faithfully, the way a good daughter does. For the first 2 years, I want to be fair, both of my children were attentive in the ways that mattered. Bradley came by most Sundays. Susan flew in for holidays and my birthday. But something began to calcify around the 3-year mark that I didn't have a name for until much later. My children had, without ever discussing it explicitly with me, arrived at a shared understanding of what my remaining years were supposed to look like. Quiet, small, manageable. A widow in her late 70s, they'd decided essentially retreats from ambition, from adventure, from the expectation of continued connection, and settles into a holding pattern until the end. I noticed it first in small ways. Bradley stopped asking what I was doing with my time and started asking whether I was doing anything at all, in a tone that suggested the correct answer was resting. Susan, on our calls, would ask about my health in exhaustive detail, and then change the subject the moment I tried to talk about anything I was excited about. A book club I'd started, a watercolor class at the community center, as though enthusiasm at my age was itself a kind of symptom to be monitored, rather than a sign of an actual life being lived. The specific moment that crystallized it happened when I was 81, about a year before I made my decision. I'd mentioned over Sunday dinner at Bradley's house that I was thinking about joining a group that organized regional trips for older singles. Nothing dramatic, weekend bus trips to see fall foliage, that sort of thing, and Bradley had looked at me with an expression I can only describe as gentle condescension and said, "Mom, don't you think, at some point, you have to accept that this is just what the last chapter looks like? It's okay to just be at home. Nobody expects you to be out there anymore. Nobody expects you to be out there anymore." I drove home that night with my hands gripping the wheel harder than the roads required, and I sat in my own kitchen, the one I mentioned at the start, the one where I'd made 18 years of breakfasts, and I felt something I hadn't felt since Walter's funeral, a very specific, very cold fury. Not at Bradley exactly, at the sentence itself. At the idea, apparently now shared by both of my children without either of them having explicitly discussed it, that 81 years old was a life stage with a predetermined shape, and that shape was solitude, dressed up as acceptance. I want to be honest that what followed was not, initially, a rational process. It was fueled, for the first several weeks, almost entirely by spite. I told myself, more than once, some version of, I will show him exactly what the last chapter looks like. But spite, I've found, is an excellent motivator for starting a project, even if it's a poor foundation for finishing one properly. And somewhere around the third week of furious late-night research, the spite gave way to something more durable, genuine curiosity, and underneath that, an actual hunger I hadn't let myself feel in years. I started where you'd expect a former hospital administrator to start, with data. I researched retirement destinations methodically, comparing healthcare infrastructure, cost of living, visa requirements, expat community size, climate, safety statistics. I built an actual spreadsheet, 6 columns, color-coded, the kind of document that would have made Bradley proud of my organizational instincts if he'd had any idea what it was actually for. Portugal came up often in my research. So did Mexico and Costa Rica and Malaysia. But the Philippines kept surfacing in ways that specifically addressed the thing I was actually looking for, which wasn't cheap living or good weather, though those things mattered. What I was looking for was community. Proof that a woman my age wouldn't disappear into a quiet apartment somewhere, replicating the exact isolation I was trying to escape, just with better weather. I found an online community of expats, mostly older, mostly widowed or divorced, who wrote about the Philippines with a specific emphasis I hadn't found in the Portugal or Mexico forums, not about beaches or cost of living primarily, but about being seen. About neighbors who noticed if you didn't leave your house for a day. About being folded into extended families that weren't your own by blood but functioned, in practice exactly like family. I found a specific thread about Bohol, an island I'd genuinely never heard of before that month, known primarily, I learned, for its unusual geological formation called the Chocolate Hills, and for the tarsier, a tiny primate found almost nowhere else on Earth. Several posters described Tagbilaran, the small capital city, and the surrounding towns as having a slower, more residential character than some of the more touristed Philippine destinations, with a strong sense of neighborhood cohesion. One post, from a woman named Patricia who'd been there 11 years, described something that I read 4 times before I finally closed my laptop that night. She wrote, "I came here at 73, terrified I was too old to build anything new. What I found is that Filipino culture doesn't retire you the way American culture does. You don't age out of belonging here. You just keep belonging, differently." I sat with that sentence for a long time. I did not tell Bradley or Susan what I was researching, for reasons that will be obvious given how the last conversation with Bradley had gone. If I'd mentioned it prematurely, I knew exactly what would happen, a chorus of concerned questions functioning as a soft, loving campaign to talk me out of it before I'd even fully decided for myself. So I researched in private for nearly 5 months, methodically working through the practical questions a former hospital administrator instinctively knows to ask. I looked into the Special Resident Retirees Visa program, learning that applicants over 50 could qualify with a $10,000 deposit into an accredited Philippine bank, or a lower threshold if they could document a qualifying pension. I researched Bohol's medical infrastructure specifically, finding that while the island's main hospital, Governor Celestino Galara's Memorial, handled most routine and even moderately serious care well, anything requiring advanced cardiac intervention would mean a flight to Cebu City, about 40 minutes by air, or several hours by a combination of ferry and land travel. I noted that detail carefully. Given my own cardiac history, I'd had a mild arrhythmia diagnosed years earlier, well managed with medication, but not nothing, and I wanted, going in, to have a completely clear-eyed understanding of what I'd be trading in terms of proximity to advanced care. I built that into my planning from the very beginning, rather than discovering the gap later and being surprised by it. 5 months in, I booked a solo reconnaissance trip. 3 weeks, structured the way I used to structure hospital site visits when I was evaluating a new facility for our network, methodical, with a checklist, not a vacation but genuine due diligence. I told Bradley and Susan I was joining a friend from my book club on an educational tour of Southeast Asian history, which was, I want to be honest, a version of the truth stretched considerably past its natural shape. I flew out of Richmond in March, with layovers in Los Angeles and Manila, nearly 26 hours of total travel time, arriving in Bohol via a short connecting flight from Manila into Tagbilaran's small airport, exhausted in a way that had transcended ordinary tiredness and become something closer to a suspended, floating clarity. The heat and humidity hit me the moment I stepped off the plane, thick and immediate, and the airport itself was small enough that I collected my bags within minutes, a welcome contrast to the sprawling confusion of Manila's main terminal, which I'd passed through on my layover. I'd arranged, through the online community I'd been part of for months, to be met by a driver named June, recommended by several of the expats whose posts I'd read, who ran a small transport service catering specifically to newly arrived foreigners still finding their footing. Jun was probably in his 50s, unfailingly cheerful, and spent the 40-minute drive from the airport to the small guest house I'd booked near Panglao Island, technically a separate island connected to Bohol by a causeway, known for its beaches, pointing out landmarks with the pride of a man showing off his actual home rather than performing a tour script. I checked into the guest house, run by a Filipino woman named Marilu, who was probably in her 60s, and who greeted me not with the polished efficiency of hotel staff, but with the specific warmth of someone welcoming an actual guest into her actual home, which, functionally, it was. That first evening, still disoriented from the travel, I walked down toward the beach road near the guest house as the sun began to set, and found a small collection of plastic tables and chairs outside a family-run eatery, where an older woman was grilling fish over charcoal, the smell reaching me before I'd consciously decided to stop. I sat, somewhat uncertainly, and the woman came over, and in halting but perfectly functional English, walked me through what she had available that evening. I ordered grilled tilapia and rice, and while I waited, her granddaughter, maybe 7 years old, appeared from somewhere behind the eatery and sat directly across from me at my small table, entirely uninvited, and simply stared at me with the frank, unguarded curiosity that I'd later learn is fairly universal among Filipino children encountering an unfamiliar foreigner. "Where are you from?" she asked. "Virginia," I told her. "In America. Are you alone?" The question landed harder than a 7-year-old could have possibly intended. "Yes," I said. "I'm alone right now." She considered this with the seriousness only children bring to conversations adults have made complicated. You can sit with us, she said, as though this resolved the matter entirely, and then hopped up and returned a moment later with a small dish of something sweet, a kind of coconut dessert, and set it in front of me. My Lola made this. You should have some. I ate that unsolicited dessert, sitting at a plastic table on a beach road on the other side of the world from everyone who had ever known me, next to a child who had decided, entirely on her own authority, that I should not be alone for dinner. And I thought, with a clarity that startled me, this is the specific thing Bradley told me I should stop expecting from the world. And it just handed itself to me, unasked, within 6 hours of my arrival. I spent the following 2.5 weeks doing exactly the kind of methodical due diligence that had defined my working life, treating the trip as a genuine evaluation rather than a vacation I was talking myself into. I toured Governor Celestino Galara's Memorial Hospital in Tagbilaran, walking through the facility with the practiced eye of someone who'd spent 36 years assessing exactly this kind of institution, and came away reasonably satisfied, clean, adequately staffed, English spoken fluently, with a functioning cardiology department for routine monitoring, though I confirmed, as I'd read, that anything requiring advanced intervention would mean transport to Cebu. I met with a Filipino attorney in Tagbilaran who specialized in the SRRV process for foreign retirees, walking through the specific documentation requirements with the same rigor I'd once brought to hospital compliance audits. I toured 5 different rental properties before settling on a small house in a residential neighborhood outside Tagbilaran proper, close enough to town for groceries and medical access, quiet enough to feel like an actual neighborhood rather than a tourist enclave, with a landlady, Mrs. Deposoy, who lived on the same street and had rented to 2 other foreign retirees previously, references I called personally before making any decision. I attended, through a connection made in the online expat community, a monthly gathering of retired foreign women living on Bohol, a loosely organized group of perhaps a dozen women, ranging from their late 60s to, I was pleased to discover, one woman in her late 80s, who met for lunch and conversation on the second Saturday of every month. I sat with them for nearly 3 hours, listening to women discuss the specific texture of their lives. A woman named Ruth, originally from Ontario, who'd built an entire second career at 74 teaching English part-time at a local school. A woman named Diane, from Australia, whose Filipino neighbors had essentially adopted her into their extended family after her own husband passed, including her in birthdays and baptisms and holidays as though she'd been born into it. By the end of those 3 weeks, I hadn't signed a lease yet, but I'd stopped evaluating whether this could work, and started evaluating only how quickly I could make it real. I flew home and, within 6 weeks, had made the decision concrete, the house sold, the details of the move underway, before telling either of my children the full truth. I told them together, deliberately, over a video call rather than in person, because I wanted to be able to finish my full explanation without either of them redirecting the conversation before I'd made my case completely. Bradley's first response was silence, long enough that I asked if the connection had dropped. It hadn't. "Mom," he finally said, "is this about what I said last year, about the last chapter?" "Yes," I told him plainly. "It is entirely about that. I didn't mean it the way it sounded, apparently. I understand that you didn't intend it cruelly, but I want you to understand how it landed. You told me, at 81 years old, that I should stop expecting the world to include me. And I have decided instead to move somewhere that has never once suggested I'm supposed to stop expecting that." Susan, on the call from Denver, was quieter, more careful in her questions, in the way she'd always been. "Mom, I'm not trying to talk you out of it. I just need to understand the practical parts. What happens with your heart condition if something happens there? What's the actual emergency plan?" I walked her through everything I'd researched: the hospital in Tagbilaran, the 40-minute flight to Cebu for anything more serious, the international health insurance policy I'd already secured, which covered medical evacuation if truly necessary. I could hear her writing some of it down. "You've actually thought this through," she said, sounding genuinely surprised. "I have spent 36 years thinking things through professionally," I told her. "I don't know why either of you assumed that capacity had an expiration date." Bradley, to his credit, was quiet for a long moment before saying, "I think I need to sit with what I said last year. I don't think I understood, when I said it, that I was handing you a sentence instead of just an observation." "You were," I said. "But I appreciate you seeing that now, even if it took this to get there." I moved into the house near Tagbilaran in a neighborhood called Dowis in September, with 3 suitcases and a single shipping box containing photographs, a few of Walter's books, and the wedding china that had somehow survived 52 years and a cross-continental move. Mrs. Deposoy, my landlady, appeared at my door within the first 2 days, holding a plate of something wrapped in banana leaf, introducing it as suman, a sticky rice dessert, and informed me, in the specific tone of someone stating an obvious fact rather than offering a favor, that I would be joining her family for dinner on Sundays from now on, an arrangement I had not been consulted about and would not have changed if I could. I built a rhythm over the following weeks that felt, for the first time since Walter's decline began years earlier, entirely mine and entirely full. Mornings on a small covered patio with coffee, watching the neighborhood wake children in school uniforms walking past, a rooster whose scheduling apparently answered to no earthly authority, a fish vendor's cart making its rounds with a specific bell I learned to listen for. I joined the monthly gathering of retired foreign women I'd met on my reconnaissance trip, which quickly became a weekly, informal habit rather than a monthly event, several of us meeting for coffee 2 or 3 times between the official gatherings. I began volunteering through a connection made by Ruth, the Canadian woman teaching English, at the same local school, working with a small group of older students on conversational English, and, eventually, on basic hospital administration concepts for a handful of young people considering healthcare careers, an unexpectedly perfect use of 36 years of professional experience that I hadn't imagined would have any further application in this chapter of my life. Mrs. Deposoy's Sunday dinners became the anchor of my week. Her extended family, sprawling and loud and warm, absorbed me into their gatherings with a completeness that startled me every single week, even after months of it. Her grandson, a serious, quiet boy of about 10 named Bong, took to sitting beside me specifically, asking detailed questions about America that suggested he'd been saving them up all week, and eventually began bringing me his school assignments to review, an arrangement that made me, in every functional sense, a de facto grandmother to a child I shared no blood with whatsoever. 4.5 months into my new life, on an ordinary Tuesday morning, I fainted in my own kitchen. I don't remember the actual moment of losing consciousness. I remember standing at the counter making coffee, and I remember waking up on the tile floor with a throbbing pain in my hip and a confused, frightened understanding that some amount of time had passed that I had no memory of. What I understand now, pieced together afterward by doctors, is that my heart had gone into a more serious arrhythmic episode than the mild condition I'd been managing for years. A sudden drop in blood pressure severe enough to cause the fall, and dangerous enough, left unaddressed, to potentially cause something considerably worse. I want to tell you what happened next, because it is, I think, the single most important part of this entire story, more important even than the decision to move in the first place. I did not have to call anyone. Mrs. Deposoy's daughter, who lived 2 houses down and habitually walked past my patio on her way to the market most mornings, noticed I wasn't sitting outside with my coffee at my usual time. She knocked. When I didn't answer within a reasonable window, she used the spare key Mrs. Depassoy kept for exactly this kind of situation, and found me on the kitchen floor, conscious but disoriented, unable to fully stand. Within 20 minutes, I had 3 neighbors in my kitchen, one of whom had already called for transport, and within the hour I was at Governor Celestino Galares Memorial Hospital, where the emergency staff took my symptoms seriously immediately, ran an EKG, and determined, within a few hours, that the arrhythmia had progressed to a point requiring more advanced intervention than the local hospital could provide. I was transferred by medical flight to a private hospital in Cebu City the following morning, the exact contingency I'd researched, planned for, and insured against functioning exactly as I'd designed it to, which felt, even in my frightened and physically weakened state, like a strange vindication of 36 years of professional instinct. I spent 9 days in Cebu, undergoing a procedure to address the arrhythmia more definitively, a cardiac ablation. For anyone familiar with the terminology, under the care of a cardiologist trained partly in Australia, whose English was flawless and whose bedside manner was considerably warmer than several American specialists I'd dealt with over the years. Mrs. Depassoy flew to Cebu the day after my transfer and stayed the entire 9 days, sleeping in a chair beside my hospital bed most nights, despite my repeated, half-hearted insistence that she didn't need to. Ruth came for 4 of those days. Diane sent a stream of messages I was too weak, initially, to properly respond to, but which I read every single one of, several times, once I felt strong enough. Bradley flew out the moment Susan called him with the news, Susan having been the emergency contact I'd registered with the hospital, a detail that meant something to both of us, I think, though neither of us said so directly. He arrived on the 5th day, and I want to describe what he found, because it mattered enormously to everything that came after. He found his 82-year-old mother, recovering from a cardiac procedure 10,000 miles from home, surrounded not by isolation and quiet resignation, but by an actual crowd. Mrs. Depassoy asleep in the chair, Ruth having just left after an afternoon visit, a card from Bong on the bedside table with a drawing of what I can only assume was meant to be a heart, given the context, though it more closely resembled a slightly deflated balloon. Bradley stood in the doorway for a long moment before he said anything at all. I pictured this completely differently. He finally said, sitting down in the second chair Mrs. Depassoy had apparently arranged to have brought in for exactly this contingency. I pictured you alone in a hospital room, somewhere I couldn't get to fast enough, and I was ready to be furious about it. I had the whole speech ready on the plane. What happened to the speech? He gestured, slightly helplessly, at the room around us, the get-well cards, the container of food Mrs. Depassoy had brought that morning specifically because she'd decided the hospital's offerings were inadequate, the message thread on my phone, which he'd apparently glanced at while I was sleeping, showing nearly 40 messages from people who had known me less than a year. I don't have the speech anymore, he said. I came here ready to tell you that this is exactly what I was afraid of, that this is exactly why you shouldn't have done this alone at your age. And instead, I got here and found out you weren't alone at all. You were more surrounded than I think you've been since Dad died. I let that sit for a moment before responding. Bradley, I need you to understand something, and I need you to actually hear it, not just process it politely. When you told me, at 81, that I should accept the last chapter looking quiet and small, you weren't describing an inevitability. You were describing an absence of effort. Loneliness at my age isn't a natural law. It's usually just a failure of infrastructure. Nobody built the systems that would keep an old woman connected. So people assume the loneliness itself is the natural state, rather than the neglect that produced it. And here, he said slowly, someone built the infrastructure. Here, I said, the infrastructure was never dismantled in the first place. This entire culture still has systems for keeping their elders inside the fabric of daily life. We took ours apart, gradually, over decades, and then told ourselves the resulting isolation was just what aging looks like. He sat with that for a long time, and then he said something I hadn't expected. I think I need to apologize for more than what I said last year. I think I need to apologize for not asking why you'd need so much reassurance about your own competence in the first place. I think Susan and I built a story about your decline that had nothing to do with actual evidence, and once we'd built it, we just kept confirming it to each other, and I don't think either of us ever seriously questioned whether it was true. It wasn't true, I said. It still isn't. He stayed for 6 days, watching the parade of visitors continue. Mrs. de Passoy's daughter came twice. Bong sent another, more successful drawing. A woman I barely knew from the monthly women's gathering showed up simply because she'd heard through the community and wanted to bring flowers. By the time he flew home, he'd stopped watching the visitors with the wary skepticism he'd arrived with, and started, I noticed, actually greeting them by name. I was cleared to return to Bohol after a follow-up appointment confirmed the ablation had resolved the underlying issue, and Mrs. de Passoy insisted on accompanying me back on the ferry, despite my protests that I was entirely capable of managing the trip myself. I know you are capable, she told me in the specific tone she uses when a matter is not actually open for negotiation. This is not about capability. This is about not letting you come home to an empty house after what happened. Someone should be there when you walk back in. Someone was. Half the street, as it turned out. A small, spontaneous gathering had assembled outside my house, Bong holding a sign he'd made that read, in careful 10-year-old handwriting, "Welcome home, Lola Vivian," which was the first time I'd heard myself referred to that way, and which undid me considerably more than the cardiac procedure had. Susan flew out 2 months later, once I'd fully recovered, wanting to see for herself what her brother had described over several long phone calls since his own visit. She arrived with the same careful, evaluative posture Bradley had brought, and I let her look, the same way I'd let Bradley look, without performing anything for her benefit. She sat in on one of Bong's tutoring sessions, watching me work through a reading passage with the same patient attention I'd apparently brought to 36 years of hospital staff training, translated now into an entirely different context. She joined the monthly women's gathering during her visit, listening to Ruth and Diane describe their own versions of this same late-life reconstruction, and I watched her face shift gradually over the course of her week, from evaluation towards something closer to recognition. On her last evening, sitting on my small patio with 2 glasses of the local rum, she said, "I think I owe you an apology too. I think I was quieter about it than Bradley, but I was building the same story. I just expressed it through worry instead of through blunt statements. But worry can be its own kind of sentence, I think. I was worrying about you in a way that assumed the worst was already happening, instead of actually looking at what you were building." "I appreciate you saying that," I told her. "And I want you to know, the worry isn't the problem. The problem was worry that had already decided the ending before it bothered checking the actual evidence." It has been just over a year since Bradley sat across from me at my own kitchen table and told me to accept that my final years were meant to be quiet. I am not going to tell you this move eliminated every hard thing. My cardiac condition remains something I manage carefully, with a level of vigilance I didn't need to bring to my life before the fall in my kitchen. The distance from my children is real, and Susan's 20-hour flight, Bradley's similarly long journey, mean that in a genuine emergency, there will always be a gap of hours, sometimes a full day, before either of them could physically be at my side. I have made my peace with that gap by building, deliberately, and with the same rigor I once brought to hospital operations, an entire local support system designed to function in the space that gap represents. I still miss things about my old life, the specific quality of a Virginia autumn, the particular comfort of a house Walter and I built our whole marriage inside of. Those losses are real, and I don't pretend the move erased them. But here is what I have now that I did not have at that kitchen table a year ago. I have a Sunday dinner I am expected at, not invited to as a courtesy but expected at, the way family is expected. I have a 10-year-old boy who calls me Lola and brings me his homework. I have a group of women, ranging from their late 60s into their 80s, who have proven, collectively, that late life doesn't have a predetermined shape unless you agree to one. I have, at 82 years old, an actual, ongoing, expanding life, not a holding pattern, not a quiet chapter I'm dressing appropriately for, but a life still being built, still surprising me, still capable of nearly ending in a cardiac emergency, and then, remarkably, continuing to grow past it. If you are sitting somewhere right now, having been told, by someone who loves you, by your own tired assumptions, by the specific quiet weight of a culture that retires its elders from expectation itself, that your remaining years are supposed to be small, I want to tell you what I wish I'd understood decades earlier. Loneliness in old age is not a natural law. It is usually just an infrastructure failure, and infrastructure can be rebuilt, at any age, if you're willing to go looking for the place that never tore it down in the first place. I'm 82 years old, and I refused the sentence I was handed at my own kitchen table. And some evenings now, sitting on my patio in Dowie's, with Bong's homework, spread across my lap, and Mrs. Deposoy's voice carrying over from her kitchen 2 doors down, I think about the woman who sat across from her son and absorbed that sentence like it was simply a fact of weather. I want to reach back and tell her, it was never the weather. It was just a door somebody forgot to keep open. Go find the door that's still open. There's always at least one.